Hello, and welcome to the 92nd Street Y New York series, The State of New York, where we give you a chance to get to know the people making decisions about New York's future. We want this series to serve as a platform for fostering meaningful dialogue and to introduce you to the decision makers who are creating New York's future, giving you the opportunity to learn more about what makes our city tick and the pressing issues that shape our lives. I'm Seth Pinsky, CEO of 92NY, and today we're addressing the role of childcare as a societal and economic factor in New York City. To discuss this, I'm joined by Grace Rauh, whose organization, 5 Borough, recently released a report examining how access to quality childcare has emerged as a major factor in the future of New York City. Stay tuned after our conversation for a discussion with distinguished journalists and New York City experts Nicole Gelinas and Brigid Bergin, who will lend their perspectives on the topics covered in the interview. Thanks to each and every one of you for joining us today. So let's get started. We're here today with Grace Rauh from the 5 Borough Institute. Grace, it's great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Seth.
I should disclose before we start that my wife is actually on the board of the 5 Borough Institute, but I promise that that won't influence the questions that I ask in any way. So today we're talking about a report that you issued earlier this year called Investing in Families in Our Future, a Policy Roadmap to Address New York City Childcare Needs Now. And in the report, you talk about this major issue and the importance that this issue holds for all of us in the city. And just before we dive into the topic, in addressing childcare, you have a very specific definition of what you're focusing on. My understanding is that there are different types of childcare and also that you're focusing on specific age ranges. So can you maybe just start for our audience by describing what it is that you're focusing on with this report?
Sure. Thanks so much, Seth. So we're focusing on child care centers. This is not a report about nannies or people who rely on relatives to watch their children, or maybe a parent that stays home to watch a child. This is about our child care system as a whole across New York City, which is a mix of child care centers that may be on sort of ground floor real estate that you might see around, as well as home-based licensed child care facilities. So these are for children who are not yet enrolled in school, so primarily 0 to 3, 0 to 4, or in some cases 0 to 5. Some of the age ranges have evolved as we now have universal pre-K and nearly universal 3K across New York City. But that's the universe that we're focused on when we talk about childcare.
Great. So now, understanding what you mean by childcare, let's dive into the report. And you open the report with a pretty dire assessment of the state of childcare in the city. I think the quote in the opening sentence of your executive summary is that childcare in New York City is a broken market in need of intervention. And you go on in the report to talk about the fact that basically all of the problems facing childcare in the city can be boiled down to two main issues. One is that childcare costs too much. And the other is that the supply of childcare is insufficient to meet demand. Can you give a little more color about both of these problems? And can you explain why, though these are problems that exist all across the country, they are particularly acute here in New York?
Sure. So let's also zoom back a little bit for people who might be watching this who don't have children, who are not living this crisis day in and day out. Any parent in New York City of a young child is very familiar with the challenges associated with childcare. But for those who aren't, they may not be aware just how difficult it is to both access and pay for childcare in New York City. So on the access front, we simply do not have enough seats to meet the demand and meet the needs of New York City families. We only have, for every child in New York City under the age of 5, I should say, we only have one licensed childcare seat in New York City for every 2 children under the age of 5. So we know that not every single child or every family is trying to access one of these licensed seats, but many of them are. And it's incredibly competitive and difficult to get your child into some of these programs. So we have a supply challenge that we need to address. And then there's the cost to families, which is quite significant. On average, New York City families pay $20,000 a year for childcare for one child. That comes close in many places to the cost of college tuition for families. And this is just to find a safe, secure, and ideally, we think having high quality childcare is essential. But at this point, we have families that are paying that much just to have a safe and secure place for their child to go during the day. Anecdotally, if you talk to New Yorkers, many of them will tell you that they are paying far more than that. I just spoke with a former colleague who has a newborn baby, lives in Brooklyn, and is scouting out childcare centers and options in his neighborhood. The one that he and his wife like the best would cost them close to $4,000 a month. There was another facility that was a little more affordable, closer to $2,200, $2,300 a month, but of course that one had an incredibly long wait list, so he was not confident that they would be able to get their child into that center. And that's just one example of the challenges and conversations that so many parents of young children are having as they navigate these two big challenges when it comes to childcare.
But let me ask this. So if I'm a parent of a 3 or 4-year-old and I'm facing these challenges, I can understand why everything that you write in your report would be both alarming and relevant. But let's say that I'm a parent of a 15-year-old or a 25-year-old, or I don't even have kids. Why is it that I, as a New Yorker, should care about the problems that these families that you're describing are having? Why is it relevant to the rest of us in the city?
Great question. And fundamentally, childcare is about economic development. And right now, we know that the city of New York itself estimates that New York City loses about $23 billion a year from parents who are either downshifting their careers or leaving the workforce to meet their family's childcare needs. $23 billion. We at the Five Borough Institute have been talking with business leaders over the last few months about our report. And we know that the childcare system and the needs that we have in our childcare system are showing up for employers who are having a harder time recruiting talent, keeping employees in their jobs because some families and parents say, look, I need to take a leave of absence or I need to put my career on pause. It has a huge economic impact. Parents who pause their careers, and these are primarily women we know who are most likely to pause their careers or leave the workforce to care for children. Over their lifetime, they can expect to lose an average of $500,000 in lost lifetime earnings as a result of those career pauses to care for children. All of that has an impact on our economy. If families are spending all of their money on childcare, they have less money to spend on restaurants or the theater or cultural institutions in our city. And then those are just for the families who choose to stay here. We know that the high cost of childcare is cited as a top reason families are choosing to leave New York. It's part of a broader set of affordability challenges that we have in New York right now, but childcare is really top of mind. There's recent data out this year that shows that families with children under the age of 6 are twice as likely to leave New York City compared to the average New York adult.
So there are a variety of reasons why childcare is actually more important than just an issue that families with young children need to worry about. We have economic activity that we're missing. It's driving talent out of the city. So let's stipulate that childcare is an important issue for all of us to think about. You issued your report earlier this year, and in the report you have, I think, over 50 initiatives divided into 7 different categories. I want to I'm going to want to dive into some of the specifics in the report in a few minutes, but at a very high level, can you just talk about how you and the Five Borough Institute have been thinking about what you believe is the right way for us to address what is clearly a dire situation here in New York?
Sure. So this report lays out a series of policy reforms that are almost entirely within the city's control to change. This is not something to make sort of broader structural changes, which we do believe are necessary to fundamentally address our childcare needs long term. And we think, as we state in the report, that New York City's the ultimate goal here should be a universal childcare system, by which we mean a system that allows all families to access affordable and reliable, high-quality childcare. We don't have anything close to that right now. We think that's where we need to be headed. But our report focused more on the here and now. What are the policy levers that our city leaders can pull? These are largely low or no-cost reforms that can be made to stabilize the sector and provide a pretty immediate lifeline, not just to families, but also to childcare providers. These businesses are incredibly difficult to run. No one is making lots of money off of running their childcare center. The vast majority of expenses are being spent on employee salaries, which, by the way, are among the lowest in New York State. So this is a workforce that is not paid competitively, which leads to a lot of turnover. These are not jobs that people tend to stay in for long periods of time, in part because they don't pay enough. And yet, the only recourse that many childcare providers have to pay higher wages, keep their staff longer, pay the rent on their facility is to raise prices for parents and families, and we know that parents are really at a breaking point. So we looked at what are the immediate reforms that are within the city's control. A few of them would require some cooperation from the state, but largely things that are within control of the city that could help in the short term to stabilize the sector and improve access and affordability.
So after, I think, many years of really, if not ignoring, paying very little attention to the issue of childcare. Over the last 5 or 10 years, city government in particular has gotten much more active on this front. The de Blasio administration, as you said, introduced universal pre-K. The Adams administration came out in 2022 with a blueprint for addressing childcare. There was a 10-point plan that was agreed upon by the city council and the mayor in this year's budget. I'm wondering, just so that our viewers understand, how is what you're proposing different or additive to what has already been put forward by these various leaders in New York City government?
So I would say this: we have thankfully had leaders in city government who have said this issue is a priority and needs to be a priority. And what we saw happen in New York with the creation of universal pre-K really showed us what is possible when city government sets an ambitious goal and then devotes all of its energy towards meeting that goal. And that's really what happened with universal pre-K, which now is a hugely popular program. Parents are clamoring for more 3K seats in their neighborhoods. So we know that this is something that has worked. There's really positive feedback from families, and it has provided a real financial lifeline to families who are saving on average about $20,000 a year in money that they would otherwise potentially have spent on private pre-K. When it comes to the childcare blueprint that you talked about, again, many of the ideas in there are ones that we support and agree with and are also included in our own childcare plan. What has been more challenging over the last few years has been the execution on the city's child care goals. So we have seen a lot of positive conversation, ambitious goals, and public commitments to doing more. And in many cases, some of those commitments have been met. I don't want to downplay that at all, but there is still much more to be done. One of the big challenges related to childcare is that it is really fragmented across a number of city agencies. It's not like the public school system where everything is largely contained within the Department of Education. The Department of Health plays a role, the Department of Education, Administration for Children's Services. So one of the ideas that the Adams administration had, which we are supportive of, was the creation of an Office of Childcare that would live at City Hall and be designed to kind of break down these silos, cut through red tape, and make the reforms necessary to bolster the entire sector. That position was created. Someone was appointed to lead it. There's no one in that role anymore. They lasted less than a year, and the head of that office that position's been vacant for some time now, and it's just an example of, I think, the opportunity that we still have to move the ball forward. I think here the issue has been less about goal setting, and the challenge has been more in terms of execution. And so our policy report really drilled down into the executable ideas that we believe are within reach if there is a real focus from our city leaders to pull those levers and make those reforms.
And so I want to focus on start with one of those proposals. And this was something that really jumped out at me. One of the things that you talked about in the report is the fact that many childcare centers are having a difficult time making ends meet because there's money that they are owed by the city that the city is delinquent in paying to them. And in fact, you talk about the problem being so acute that one of your proposals is that there actually be a loan program so that people can access money and then pay it back when the city actually pays them. Given how important this issue is to so many families and how important it is to the city as a whole, why is this something that isn't already fixed, especially with administrations, as you were describing, who are agreeing that this is an issue that the city needs to focus on?
It's a great question, Seth. We know that one of the reasons that these payments have been slowed down or are not being issued to childcare providers in a timely fashion has to do with gaps in our public sector workforce, which is another topic that Five Borough really focused on about 2 years ago when we saw really a mass exodus of public sector employees leaving city government jobs. These gaps across city agencies had a huge impact on our ability as a city to deliver timely services to New Yorkers. And we saw that play out when it came to payments for childcare providers. So I don't know that all of those delays can be chalked up to gaps in staffing, but I believe that is part of the reason why we have seen a real slowdown and delay in terms of those payments. And just think about that for a minute. We know, and this has been reported in the press, that there are childcare providers who have had to dip into their own savings or open up new lines of credit to keep the doors open on their childcare centers. When a childcare center closes for any reason, whether it be a licensing problem or, in this case, a director that says, I can no longer pay my bills, I'm left with no choice but to shut down, that is an incredibly destabilizing situation for every family that sends their child to that center. Suddenly, overnight, parents are needing to scramble to make plans for where their kids can go. New York Magazine recently had just jaw-dropping story from a journalist there who talked about her own child's daycare center being shut down for a licensing issue, and it took many months for it to get back online. During that time, she turned her apartment into a de facto childcare center so other kids would have a place to go. these are not things that are good for the city of New York when you want to have a healthy, vibrant economy and have a dependable workforce where people can come to work when they're supposed to and show up and have that predictability and reliability. So I think that that's a great example of a cost neutral, something that should be a cost neutral reform. We already have these payments baked into the city's budget. The city has entered contracts with these childcare providers to help pay for their services, and we're just not getting the money out the door. So there are a lot of examples like that that are deeply confounding, I think, to people outside of government. And effectively what we were trying to say in our report is these reforms are within reach. We can do better. We want to shine a spotlight on the ones that would have really the most dramatic effect in the shortest period of time, and again, are within the city's power to change.
Well, and I want to pick up on another example of a cost-neutral reform that one would think would be easy to address. You talk about how difficult it is to operate a business like a childcare facility in the city. And some of the problems that you cite are problems that all small businesses face. And some of them are problems that are compounded because they're childcare facilities, the licensure requirements, the inspection requirements, et cetera. I guess I'll ask kind of the same question that I was asking with the last question, but in the opposite way. So the last question was why this seems so easy to fix. Why hasn't this been fixed? On the flip side, with kind of making it easier to do business for organizations like this, given that the city has such a poor track record and has for many, many years of making any business find it easier to operate here in the city, what makes you confident that the city could potentially accomplish that goal on behalf of childcare centers?
I think that when there is political will inside government, our government can do great things and do it really quickly. So in the real estate world right now, we have City Hall created an office conversion accelerator, right? This is someone within city government whose job it is to make conversions from offices to apartments as quick and seamless as possible. This is not to say that now that process is completely seamless and easy. It's not, far from it. But that type of mindset is one that we have seen this administration embrace in other aspects. And that, I think, was the promise of the Office of Childcare when it was created, this idea that this agency will cut through red tape. It will be able to support childcare providers and families with reforms like this. You can imagine kind of a task force that has representatives from the Department of Buildings, Fire, Health, that do inspections together so that there don't need to be 3 separate inspections on different days and different questions that are being asked, but sort of a single day where all the issues and questions that the city has can be addressed at one moment. So again, I think some of this is about political will and about prioritizing reforms that we know will make a big difference for families. And we've seen this mindset. We've seen this approach with other issues like office conversions. We know that it can be possible here. And so again, part of the idea of this report was to elevate this issue, make it as clear, as easy as possible for our city leaders to see what is within their power to do, and also to hear from New Yorkers outside of government and outside, frankly, of the childcare advocacy world, right? We in New York are blessed with a number of advocacy and research groups that are laser focused on childcare. Five Borough came to this issue in partnership with many of those organizations, but we really felt that as a think tank, a nonpartisan organization that is laser focused on developing and advancing smart solutions to big challenges facing New York, we could help elevate this issue. And I think that we have. We're certainly generating a lot of conversation about what is within the city's power to do to stabilize the sector and help families.
So I want to jump now to what you described earlier and what is described in the report as what ideally you would like to see the ultimate goal be, which is to create a guarantee of free or low-cost, high-quality childcare for all families in the city. And I want to ask this in a way that doesn't sound insensitive, but in the report, you talk about an estimate for a program like that being about $20 billion, I think, each year, and that we already spend about $3 or $3.5 billion, so it would require an increment of only $16 or $17 billion a year. And we've clearly established that this is an issue that is a serious issue, and it's an issue that has significant impacts on the city. But I guess the question I have is, in a world of ultimately limited resources, which I think is the world that we're still living in, with a city that faces so many other problems, a school system that's failing hundreds of thousands of children, infrastructure that's falling apart, an affordable housing crisis, how would you justify choosing to spend $16 or $17 billion if we were able to find it on that instead of so many other problems that the city is facing?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking it. The $20 billion figure overall would be for statewide universal childcare. And we do think that this would need to be potentially something done on a statewide level, which is why we zeroed in on that figure. Ultimately, though, we at Five Borough think about this as an economic investment overall. We can look to other models to show us what could be possible in New York City. So Quebec in Canada has a universal childcare model where families pay no more than $10 a day for childcare. When the program was initially created, the estimates were that there would be an increase in income tax revenue for the city of Quebec from parents who are staying in the workforce longer or joining the workforce who were otherwise at home. And the expectation was that there would be 40% of the program would be paid for by an increase in income tax revenues. Today, 100% of the program is paid for by an increase in income tax revenues. This is an investment that will directly lead to more families, more parents entering the workforce, staying in the workforce, more families being able to stay in a city like New York, and more families having disposable income to pump back into our economy. We think this is an investment that will continue to pay dividends. So obviously there is an initial financial hurdle that needs to be cleared. But this is one that we think makes a ton of sense for New York and ultimately could be and would be a real economic win overall for our city. And we're having this conversation after the national election. There are other cities and counties in this country that are putting and have put recently ballot measures forward to raise taxes to pay for childcare investments. And earlier this month, we saw two of them pass in Sonoma County in California and in the county where Austin, Texas is located. Tax increases to pay for this investment in a local economy, which I think is how we need to be framing this conversation. And we talked, you mentioned sort of a competing interests. Obviously, this is a city of many challenges: public transit, housing, public education. We, as a society and a city, have made a big commitment to the children of New York. When you enroll in public school in New York City, the city and state of New York and the federal government is spending tens of thousands of dollars per year to educate your child. We give families or children a tiny fraction of that from the time that they are born to the time that they enter public education. We know that a high quality childcare environment boosts educational outcomes for children down the road. It is somewhat insane to me that we spend next to nothing on children in their earliest years when their brains are developing, when they're like little sponges learning everything. And then we sort of go from 0 to 100 when they're age 4 or 5. It doesn't make a lot of sense. This is such a critical time, and we think these investments would pay dividends down the road just in terms of economic activity in New York.
So I like to try to end these interviews on a positive note. And I'm wondering, as you look around the landscape, you mentioned some examples nationally, but here in New York in particular, are there any specific initiatives or programs that you can point to that give you hope that we're moving in the right direction and that in fact this is one of those seemingly intractable issues that we ultimately are going to be able to overcome?
I think we are seeing and hearing and talking about childcare in New York City more than we ever have before. In part, there are a few reasons for that. One is that New Yorkers saw what was possible with universal pre-K. That was a big, ambitious idea. In pretty short order, universal pre-K was rolled out across New York City. It's been hugely successful. We see parents clamoring for an expansion of it for 3-year-olds. And so I think that gave parents and families an idea of what is possible when local government and our leaders set ambitious goals and then follow through to see them over the finish line. So I think that is part of the reason we're seeing so much attention on childcare. We also lived through the pandemic and COVID, which was an incredibly challenging time for so many families with young children, for the childcare sector as well. Over the last decade or so, 1,400 childcare centers in New York City have closed their doors and not reopened. The economic model just does not work for them. It is too hard to be in business as a childcare provider. We need to change that. And then I think this is coming up more and more among business leaders. So over the last few months, as I had mentioned earlier, the Five Borough Institute, we've been meeting with business leaders across New York City to talk about our report, hear from them about how this issue is showing up. We have more and more women in senior positions of authority across the business world, and they live this issue. They know this issue. They're dealing with it themselves. Even among the most well-resourced women executives in New York understand the challenges of having good, reliable, high-quality childcare. And so I think because of that, we are seeing this elevated as an issue in new ways. And we're also, sadly, talking about it so much because we've reached this new crisis point. The public school system in New York City is losing children at a pretty alarming rate. So it was not that long ago that we used to talk about us having 1.1 million public school students in New York City. That's an incredible number. Right now, the city of New York, the Department of Education, projects that in 8 years, we're going to be down to 650,000 students across New York. We know that people are having fewer children. There are other issues at play, but fundamentally, we are seeing New York evolve and we're seeing families leave. And we know that many of the families that are leaving are citing high childcare costs as one of the main factors driving their decision. This is something we can address. We have the power to address. We think it will pay dividends back in economic activity and development. And so I'm really excited by what I am seeing and hearing and the conversations that are taking place across this city. And we want to be part of those. And I think given the collective engagement on childcare, we have to make some real progress because the public will demand it.
So some real challenges, but also some real signs of hope. Grace, thank you very much for this really engaging conversation. And I'm sure that we will have the opportunity to continue that conversation sometime soon.
Thank you, Seth. Thanks for having me.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's conversation. The topic is the topic of childcare in New York City, which is an important one for many families. The conversation that I had a few days ago with Grace Rauh started with a question that I asked, which was why people who don't have children should care about the issue of childcare. And what Grace said was that there were all sorts of economic impacts on families and on the larger economy of the city of the fact that our childcare system comes with so many problems and issues. I'm curious to ask the two of you if you think that this, in fact, is a topic that is resonating today with most New Yorkers, especially those who don't have children that are in the 0 to 5-year-old age range that the Five Borough Report focuses on. What do you think, Nicole?
Yeah, I guess I would fall into this category of people who don't have children, but who still think this is an important issue. I mean, much like if you don't have kids or your kids are grown up, you should still care about the public school system. And is the public school system doing its job? Because this is a matter of import for broader public policy. It's the same the same tenet holds for childcare. I mean, if you go to France, they have the creches. You don't have municipal childcare for children. I believe it starts around age 2. It's somewhere around there, anywhere from 18 months to 2.5. But certainly much more reliable, efficient, consistent childcare, which is good for the employers and having people be able to get reliably to work, and also good for childhood development once the kids get into public school. I mean, obviously, what happens when you're between 2 and 5 matters a lot, and it would be good not to have so much the catch-up work starting in kindergarten or starting in pre-K, if we can get some of these learning habits started earlier, which also will lead us into a different discussion of whether this is childcare or education and what the difference means.
And Brigid, what do you agree with Nicole? Do you think that this is in fact an issue that's resonating today with many voters?
I mean, I think certainly this is an issue that we have seen in recent years resonate very much with voters. I mean, early childhood education, making that distinction that Nicole pointed out, was the signature issue of Bill de Blasio's mayoral campaign in 2013. Universal pre-kindergarten was something that he ran on, and I think by all accounts is his most successful policy accomplishment of his mayoralty. I am someone who can speak to the benefits having a young child who's recently gone through both 3K and pre-K. I think there was, a demonstration that there was a real appetite to have a conversation like that across the city. We are approaching another mayoral race in 2025, and several of the candidates have started to, put out policy ideas where early childhood education figures into it. They're not all talking about it in the same way. But I think it's a good sign. And I think the framing that Grace and the Five Borough Institute brought to it as a real economic development issue for the city, regardless of whether or not you are personally impacted, is very important. We're not just talking about lost wages for a family, but we're also talking about an industry where right now these are among the lowest paid individuals. And so there's a whole series of challenges that need to be addressed when we start talking about childcare, early childhood education. And it's great that we're starting this conversation now.
And maybe a question for either of you. Why do you think that this issue is moving up the priority list of so many voters and of so many candidates as well? I mean, many of the things that you described have been true for years, and yet for years the issue was largely ignored. What do you think has changed in the last few years that has suddenly made this something that our elected officials are really focusing on?
I think one thing, as Brigid alluded to, was the success of pre-K, and also De Blasio not framing pre-K as an anti-poverty program or a subsidy program. This was framed as an entitlement for people across the income spectrum, and some of its most popular customers are middle class, upper middle class, and even upper class New Yorkers. And so, it was a little ironic that he ran on the tail of two cities, but he pitched this as something that everybody could take advantage of. And it was so successful that I think a lot of people said, we can go down a year, and once we're at 3-year-olds, which there have been some issues with that, as both in the Adams administration's management of it and of demand and supply not being matched up very well by neighborhood. But if you're going to 3-year-olds, at some point you might as well just go a year down. I think it becomes problematic to offer childcare for infants and, children who can't communicate yet. So once you get to 2 years old, I think you're probably done, but we're not so far away from that anymore. It doesn't seem like an impossible thing to do.
Well, and I want to ask a question about that. And we've been talking a lot about universal pre-K as kind of an analog for what might eventually be offered when it comes to childcare. In the 5-borough report, one of the things that the organization talks about is a goal of creating either low-cost or no-cost childcare for all families across the city, but that's the ultimate goal. And in the interim, they put forward a series of less ambitious goals. And when we talked, Grace and I, about this ambition, she cited, as the two of you have, universal pre-K as a reason why perhaps something like that could eventually come to pass. I'm wondering whether you think that universal pre-K is something that we should point at and say, oh, yes, we can do big, ambitious programs just like that when it comes to childcare, or if the fact that universal pre-K is really the only major, ambitious, universal benefit that we've rolled out as a city in the last 10 plus years proves that it's more an exception rather than the rule, and that in fact something like this may be beyond the capacity of the city to do today. How do you look at that, Brigid?
I mean, I think I look at it as showing what is possible and what is necessary, and to build a little bit onto what Nicole was saying about why childcare would be a conversation we're having, particularly in this moment, why it is rising. I mean, it is just further fallout from the pandemic, when so many people experienced the absence of the various forms of care that they cobbled together for their children, particularly at that age, and the amount of money that ends up being spent to ensure that those children are in safe places. Compounded by the fact that now we're dealing, of course, with kids who are fallen back in education. So, wanting to make sure that we give kids a good and strong start to make up for to build on the fact that we are investing billions of dollars in their education, throughout the rest of their lifetime. So I think I see it more as it shows that there is potential there. And if you look around the country, you see other places that are doing it better than we are. In Washington, D.C., there's a program that exists now where there is an investment. There's a tax on people who make over $250,000. That money is then used to go into the salaries of childcare workers. And in a recent story from NPR, what they found was that by increasing the salary of those workers, by extension, what it ended up doing was creating more stability in the system itself. So then kids were getting teachers that were doing it longer, who were doing it better. And because there was more stability there, that also increased the number of seats that were available. And so suddenly this thing that had a shortage started to, parents started to be able to find access to those 3K and pre-K seats. I think that kind of thinking is something that we can explore. Obviously, we can't tax ourselves here in New York City. We are a creature of the state. But I like the fact that we're having these conversations and looking around at places around the country where they are doing it better.
So Nicole, when we spoke to Grace, or when Grace and I spoke, I should say, one of the points that Grace made was that, well, that universal childcare goal is a longer term goal, and that there are things that we can do in the interim, as I mentioned a minute ago. And we were talking about examples of incremental progress that has been made in New York. And Grace specifically cited the mayoral initiatives like the Childcare Blueprint that the Mayor Adams put out a couple of years ago. One of the things that she said that I thought was interesting was that the blueprint was a step in the right direction, but that there were some challenges in actually implementing some of the policies that were put forward in the blueprint. She cited, for example, the fact that there had been a child care czar that was supposed to be appointed as part of the blueprint, who was going to advance child care initiatives, that the Adams administration filled that position, and then the person left the position and has now been open for quite some time. What do you think about this idea of appointing someone as an issue czar? It seems to be something that's kind of a trend in government these days, whether it's a housing czar or a nightlife czar. Do you think that in fact is a step in the right direction?
I'm not a big fan of czars because of the line of government accountability. The mayor is the mayor. I guess the mayor should be the czar. The mayor has deputy mayors. I think maybe too many deputy mayors right now. But in general, commissioners should set and execute the broad policy, and they should report to the mayor or to the deputy mayor. So I think the issue with the childcare czar is it would be better if a commissioner were in charge of this, but which commissioner? And that gets back to whether this is an education issue or a social services issue. And this has a lot to do also with what kind of programs and what kind of licensing and oversight do you need to set up? And that matters a lot to the cost of the program. So if we're trying to do this, that we need teachers to be, in charge of 2 and 3-year-olds, it gets very, very expensive. If this is more of a living wage social assistance job, then it is not quite as expensive. And the programming and the oversight, where of course you have to have inspections and licensings and fire safety and make sure, background checks and no drugs on the premises and so forth. But it's less onerous than running an education system. So I think that's one of the issues here. Is this basically babysitting? And I don't say that in a pejorative way. This is a very important job. Or is it teaching? Because that's a difference between, this could be on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars in difference.
Well, and that was another interesting point I thought that Grace brought up in the report. The Fibro Institute talks a lot about the fact that on the one hand, the teachers or instructors or caregivers in these programs are some of the lowest paid workers in the city, and that creates a challenge both for those individuals and also for the industry, because they're not able to attract as many people as they need in order to run these centers. And then on the other hand, what the report talks about is how thin the economics of many of these organizations are. I'm just wondering, Brigid, from your perspective, and as you talk to people out there in the field, do you think that people are generally looking for this to go more towards the direction of education, with therefore a higher paid workforce, or do you think that the price sensitivity is so great that people are just looking for a service that's offered at as low a cost as possible?
I mean, I think from a policy standpoint, I think people are looking for something that is accessible and that has a certain level of, universality, and that kids are being provided with care in these safe, licensed areas with potentially some early childhood education. Some of these pre-K programs, 3K programs especially, are being done in what are otherwise, considered daycare facilities. And so, I think that we're talking about here, gets into like, are we talking about people who are, teachers union employees? Are we talking about people who are, licensed caregivers? I think that's for the policy debate. I think ultimately what we need, though, is to make sure that we're starting to get to a place where parents have access to a system that they can count on, because at this point we know that families with kids under 6 are more likely to leave New York than families that don't. And so coming up with not a safety net, but the resources to make it possible to raise your family in New York City, I think that's an important conversation for us to be having.
And Nicole, do you think that the voters of New York would be open to either new forms of taxation or diverting resources that are currently coming into city government to help subsidize these kinds of services in order both to raise the quality of the services that are offered and also potentially to pay the workforce better?
Right. Remember, de Blasio came in and he wanted to tax the rich to pay for pre-K, and he had no authority on his own to increase income taxes. Cuomo certainly did not want to increase income taxes at that time. He did later, but for his own rhetorical purposes, that was not Cuomo in the tax raising era. So Cuomo gave him the pre-K without the tax increase. And that's not something that's impossible to do again. I mean, when you think about the Department of Education, the number of enrolled students is down significantly, as you talked about with Grace. I mean, we've lost something like 200,000 students, and yet the education budget just keeps going up above inflation. Could some of this school space and some of these school resources be repurposed for the earlier childhood education, rather than just, no school wants to give up their funding even as enrollment is falling? Could some of these elementary schools also start off with a child care center where then the child doesn't even have to move schools when they get into elementary school? So I think there's, particularly since you're not going to have everyone join at once, it's actually harder to convince parents to send their kids when they're 2 and 3 year old. So the enrollment would be more gradual, and see what we can do with existing resources before saying, we need another $1 billion a year when we need to raise some tax.
Well, and Brigid, let me just pick up on that point. So Nicole just said, as Grace had said as well, that population of school age kids is down, I don't know the exact percentage, something like 20% in the last 4 or 5 years. We know that we have a real crisis when it comes to childcare. Why wouldn't we be talking about potentially redirecting funding from the public schools, which are shrinking, to cover this need, which currently is so great and for which there aren't adequate public resources?
Well, I mean, we are approaching the start of a new year, and so we'll be starting the budget dance process, as it were. So I think there's always the potential that we will have some of those policy conversations, particularly if it becomes something that people really latch onto during the upcoming mayoral race. We've already started to hear some of the candidates put out different ideas around childcare, universal after school, some universal childcare. And so I think that has the potential for influencing both the city and state budget debates. So, there's that potential, but there are obviously some very strong actors involved in that. And, I don't think we would see anyone in the current city school system willing, as you said, to let go of those funds at this point. But people have to make the case. That's part of what the budgeting process is all about. And so we're gearing up for that moment to do it. I think it really will put a lot of pressure on these candidates to see if they can make this something that, voters are organized around as well.
Switching gears for a minute, another area of challenge that the Five Borough Institute report talks about for childcare centers is the fact that these centers provide services on behalf of the city, or with the understanding that they will in part be paid for by the city. And then the city is essentially delinquent in paying many of them, sometimes by many months, sometimes even by years. This seems like it should be such an easy problem to solve. One of the things that Grace talked about as potentially a reason for it's not being solved is the understaffing at many city agencies, but I'm not sure if that is the reason or if there's something else at work here. Do you have any insights into why it is that these not-for-profits, and my understanding is that this is the case with many not-for-profits, why is it that these important service providers find it so hard to get paid by the city money that they have earned and that they're owed?
I think and I know one of the ideas was you should let them borrow money to cover that gap, but then you're actually costing the city more. And the groups that lend this money, they kind of have a nice little scam going, in that you get a sort of free interest rate floating, because the city's going to pay you eventually. You just don't know when. I mean, it would make more sense for the city to just pay on time. I think it would be a good idea for the controller to put out a regular report, first of the month or the fifth of the month. This is how much nonprofits are owed this month. And the city is 5 days late, 10 days late, 30 days late on paying, and sort of put more pressure on the city to pay on time. Yes, of course, you have to go through the notary process and have to be some audits, but for the most part, they should know how many kids are approved, how many kids are enrolled, how many employees they have. And this should sort of all be set up once for the year, and just the checks after that should not be all that onerous. So to be delaying the payment is just a extra stress on these nonprofit groups.
And these are not new problems, right?
Yeah, no, and I was going to ask you. I mean, I'm sure that you and many of your fellow reporters have heard this repeatedly from not-for-profits. I know there was a series, I think, recently in the Times where they talked about this and how it's putting many very important social service organizations at risk because they're not able to bridge that gap between when they provide the services and when they get paid. Do you have any insight, Brigid, into whether this is a priority for the administration or what it would take to make it a priority for the administration?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I don't think that paying nonprofits has sort of been a perennial problem for many administrations, not just this administration. And I think in part it's because these are not necessarily the high-powered, titans of the city. They don't have lobbyists who can come in and sort of shake trees, or lawyers who are going to be able to scream and yell until they get paid in the same way some other organizations or industries do. We're talking about nonprofits that are serving often our neediest New Yorkers and kids. So they don't necessarily have the same spokespeople for their causes as others do. I think that's one of the big problems. But I think also adding visibility to the fact the city is delinquent in their payments is a great idea. And perhaps getting more coverage from people like us of that delinquency would help put some pressure on the administration. I think there are a lot of priorities to manage. The priority of this administration has, been stated very clearly. Public safety is at the very top of their list. Something like this, while important, and I think they would never say is not a priority, just doesn't rise to the same level and garner the same, organized focus as some of the other issues.
So I want to wrap up the conversation with one of the topics with which we began, which was to talk about what the Five Borough Institute said was the ultimate goal, which was to create some sort of universal program that would offer low or no cost childcare to all families. And Nicole, you alluded to this when you were talking about universal pre-K. It's interesting to me that this would be a benefit that would be universal and would not be means tested. And I'm wondering if each of you think that, in fact, that is the right way to go, or if you think that that might be a mistake, and whatever your answer is, why you think that. And I'll start with you, Nicole.
I think it should be universal and not means tested, just like the pre-K program, because you have more people that have a stake in its success. I think, though, that universal should not be confused with this similar percentage of parents who will take the city up on it. I think the take up will be it will be high, but not as high as pre-K. A lot of people, understandably, are wary of sending their kids off when they're still, 2 and 3 years old, and even 4 years old. So I think a lower uptake should not be considered a failure. That does make it more complicated. And where do you put these places? And I think one of the answers to that is, don't be afraid of informality. It doesn't, little kids don't want a group of like 40 little kids in a room. I mean, if someone wants to run a childcare center for 3 or 4 kids and do it out of a home, of course, yes, there should be a visit and a one-time inspection and maybe spot inspections after that. But these don't have to be in rented buildings. We don't have to overly bureaucratize this. It is, in the end, taking care of little kids, which we've been doing for, tens of thousands of years. It doesn't have to be sort of overlaid with a massive DOE and contracting bureaucracy.
And what do you think, Brigid?
I would agree with Nicole that I think a universal program will, provide more of the economic development benefits that sort of are at the core of the case for this idea to begin with. I also agree that I don't think it would be something that all families would take advantage of for a variety of reasons. But if the program were made universal, that there would be an opportunity to invest in it more substantially, hold it to potentially a higher standard. And then think about how it links with some of our other early education programs. Having experienced the sort of ideal versions of both 3K and pre-K in this city, I think it's a real testament to what we can do and the head start we can give our kids. I wish it was something that all families had access to in the same way that we did, but I think it's really remarkable, the investment and remarkable the impact it can have on kids if we do it at that age. So hopefully this conversation is just beginning, and we'll go further from there.
So a cautiously hopeful note to conclude on. Thank you both very much for your input and insights. This is a topic I know that all of us will be talking a lot more about, especially as we move into the mayoral race next year. But I appreciate your time very much. So thank you.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Brigid.
Thanks.
From the 92nd Street Y, New York, I'm Seth Pinsky. Thank you so much for joining me.